Ladies and gentlemen, Reverend Father, it's a great pleasure for me to be here this evening. I want to thank Joe Mulholland and the organising committee for the invitation. I would also like to congratulate him and his colleagues on their continuity. 30 years is no small achievement, and on the growing prestige and standing of this school and what it has brought to illuminate and to explore and bring insights to our national life. Chairman, I hope you'll stop the clock just for 1 minute because I'll get into my text. But it's the kind of hour of the evening where you shouldn't presume that everybody is, entirely alert and bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. It's, we're kind of seminared out and we've been in through the day and maybe we had a little tipple at dinner time. So let me tell you one of my favourite stories, after which I could sit down because it completely captures everything I feel I need to say. It's told by John Major. It's about a conversation he had with President Boris Yeltsin. The location was Chequers, the country home of the British Prime Minister. Yeltsin, as you know, was a man fond of many things, including his sauce. And John Major, anxious not to provoke an excessively long response from his visitor, said through the interpreter, Boris, tell me in a word, how are things in Russia? And the President responded to his interpreter and the answer was good. And the host thought perhaps I was too severe. He said, Boris, in more than a word, how are things in Russia? And the President answered, not good. Now, it seems to me I could now sit down because I've covered everything I really do need to say. But let me begin. I was given the theme tonight, we need higher standards of leadership and of governance. So I speak, of course, with whatever experience and background I have. But primarily, I hope I speak with some passion and conviction, with a stakeholder view. And what is that view? I'm glad to be joined here tonight by my wife, Kathy. We have 6 adult children. We have 7 grandchildren. Our 6 adult children represent the full array of hope, anxiety and fear about today's contemporary Ireland, between job security, job threat, no job and negative equity. And so in the microcosm, which is my family, I have a stakeholder interest in the space which is our republic. Let me begin with the title which says, we need higher standards. Let me begin with the we. It is said that electorates get the governments that they deserve. Subject to post-election negotiations over the past 2 decades, they certainly got the governments that they voted for. If we truly want higher standards, then we the people, the citizens of this republic, must demand and vote for those standards. We cannot absolve ourselves of all responsibility as citizens for the state we are in. Our political attitude has long tolerated a cute whore, nod and wink, look the other way and get away with it if you can culture. In our national DNA, our accountability gene has not been among our most developed. The state of affairs that I describe has been tolerated, at times even supported by the electorate. And my conclusion on the we, that which you tolerate, you may risk to become. The naturally dense networks of family and community that bind us together in our small society, and we are a small island community, and we all know someone who knows someone else, and therefore we all some way know everyone else. So we have these very tight bonds as a small community. But these have been greatly accentuated by a whole political and business ecosystem of mutually interdependent cronyism. Ours is not just a case of crony capitalism. Some names turn up so often in so many places that they represent a kind of Irish spare part elite, slotted in by one another, nominally to exercise control and surveillance over one another. This is a recipe for less than arduous transparency and accountability, and it's one of the things that has helped to wreck our nation. All systems, of course, are grounded in culture and values. Our current crisis of leadership and governments is, in my opinion, no less a crisis of values. And I agree with earlier contributions today that if we're to deal with this, we've got to strip it down to some very basic things about what we stand for and what we believe. It has been correctly observed, I think I may have first have seen it in an article penned by Colin McCarthy, that anger is not a policy. Equally, permit me to stress here tonight that apathy is not a solution. There is much to be angry about. The Irish people have been let down on many fronts. Let me give a few examples. The recent controversy over the failure to report Father Brendan Smith to the civil authorities for child abuse in the 1970s is but one of an endemic litany of such church failures. He subsequently went on to abuse other children. Thank God none of those were my children, some of whom were reported later to have committed suicide. Challenged on his role in this culture of secrecy, the Catholic Cardinal in Armagh has concluded that he should continue his ministry, noting, I think he quoted St. Paul, but I'm open to correction, that he is a wounded healer. I respect the fact that the Cardinal is fully entitled to make his own judgment, but others are entitled to draw their own conclusions. Let me switch to business and banking from a slightly different perspective, but parallel view to what you've heard. Business and banking cronyism, based on weak governance, poorly informed judgment, and in some cases bad ethics and possibly even criminal behaviour, have yielded an expensive and bitter harvest. NAMA is reaping this harvest in the name of the state and therefore of its citizens. The total cost of asset acquisitions by NAMA remains to be seen. It will certainly be 40 billion plus, maybe more. The figure originally was up to 54 billion, if I recall correctly, but the so-called haircut may get closer to the scalp in terms of the presumed value of the assets to be acquired. In any event, the eventual net outcome is as economically contested as it is conjectural. What is clear is that NAMA will be managing one of the largest and today most dubious property portfolios in the world, whose asset value on acquisition, staggeringly, is greater than the combined market capitalisation value today of the top 20 enterprises quoted on the Irish Stock Exchange. And that is a measure of the quantum of its scale. To this we must add, of course, the ever-increasing, quarter by quarter, month by month, week by week, bailout and recapitalisation costs of our banks as they are drip-fed for our public attention. Those who served as senior managers or as board members in this man-made national catastrophe, in my opinion, ought not to be among the wounded healers charged to lead us towards a new dawn. For our government, seeking comfort in the explanation that our economic ills are the fault of the subprime crisis and the collapse of the Lehman Brothers in the United States is wide of the mark. In the Eurozone, we were the first to enter recession. Ours was the fastest, deepest and longest lasting decline in national output in that zone. Other small open Eurozone economies, such as Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands and Finland, had no immunity from the global downturn, and yet comparatively, bad as things are there, they have fared much better. Our homegrown contribution to our problems and its associated economic and social costs has been immense. It is a brutal legacy whose effects will last for some years to come. We have an unemployment rate today significantly above the EU average, alarmingly so among our people under 25. We have a record number of households in negative equity, particularly again among young people who bought at peak prices, coexisting, paradoxically, with unprecedented numbers of vacant properties, all amounting to a monumental generational misallocation of scarce resources. Our public finances, over-reliant on the tax take from the property bubble, have been revealed to us as totally unsustainable. Much of this, in my opinion, is the direct result of poor public policy. Our official discourse in Ireland speaks of our future economic development, and one could go elsewhere, but let me stay with the economic part, as being smart, the knowledge economy and society, green, less CO2 emissions, better energy efficiency and more renewables, and sustainable in all the meanings, sustainable in climate terms, sustainable in economic terms, sustainable in public finance terms. Smart, green and sustainable is are the three legs of the new economic stool, and not only in Ireland. Most governments in most places are talking this language today. Our discourse is replete with references to world-class services and to centres of excellence. We're familiar with this and we hear it on a regular basis. Permit me to share with you some observations that suggest our official record is rather different to our official rhetoric. If we truly wish to be world-class, could I suggest to you that we measure our performance against relevant target groups of peers and not against average performance? Let me give you an example. My paper is not going to kill you with numbers, but let me give you a number which is not in my text. If you took the average income per head in the European Union today at a regional level, the poorest region of the European Union has an average GDP, income per capita, of just around 30% of the EU average. The richest region, which is the Greater London area in South East England, has an average GDP per capita in EU terms of 330%. The gap between 30 and 330 renders the average meaningless if you want to make a real comparison, in my view. So what I've done, and I won't explain it all out for its logic, but it should be at least implicitly apparent, I've measured some of our smart, green, sustainable logic against a comparable EU peer group of 6 other states that meet certain characteristics. They're all small open economies, so are we. They all have incomes per capita above the EU average, so do we, even in this time of economic crisis. Those countries are Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, the Netherlands and Sweden. Judged against them, our performance is sobering. Example 1, Exhibit 1 in the case, and you are the jury. According to the World Economic Forum Global Competitive Index, ours is currently the worst in class of that peer group. Do we want to be world class? And do we want to be leaders? That's what we are told we want. Don't let's compare with the average. Don't let's settle for second best. Don't let's be in the community games. Let's train to win the Olympics, if that's where we believe we have the capacity to be and to win. A decade ago, under the same index, we were among the best of those states and among the best in the world. Apart from currency fluctuation, which we couldn't control because we're in the euro, we blew our competitive advantage through a combination of price inflation, pay settlements rising faster than our competitors, high property costs, no surprise, and higher charges for electricity, waste and professional services. All of this is not new. It's not even news. It was pointed out consistently and annually throughout the noughties from 2000 until this year's report, 2010, by FIRFOS and in particular the National Competitiveness Council. Much of what is highlighted in this year's report of the National Competitive Council is a serial repeat from earlier years. A serial repeat. I went back and read every report for every year for the decade, and I could take the same paragraphs out and recycle them one year after the other. This loss of competitiveness occurred after we joined the fixed currency regime of the euro. And let me explain, and I think you will know this even if you're not an economist, that the imperative logic when you're inside a fixed currency regime is to necessitate more and not less rigorous surveillance and control where you can of your domestic cost structure. The loss of competitiveness in the past decade in these circumstances is, in my view, a political act of strategic illiteracy and folly on a grand scale. Analytically, to mention what I said, FERFOS and the National Competitive Council reports, we have analysis that is world-class. I read a lot of this stuff and for a lot of places. And what we write to each other here about our challenges is as good in its quality, capacity, reasoning and strategizing as the best you will find in the world. World-class analysis, followed politically and administratively by world-class paralysis in terms of inertia, inadequate response and non-response. A World Economic Forum Global Information Technology report. We think, well, we're very high-tech, we've Google, we've Microsoft, we used to have Dell and so on, and we are. But it's a kind of high-tech, economic, industrial ghetto in the sense that there's a disconnect in many ways from the wider society. Our performance on ICT, on the communications technology, is below the EU 15 average. I don't mention the new states because they're coming from another place. Our e-government initiatives have multiplied, and where they work, they're very good. But we've multiplied them at a slower pace than others, and comparatively, even as we've run, we've slipped behind because others are running faster. Our broadband speeds, the information highways of today and tomorrow, are more in Ireland community games than Olympic Games compared to key peer groups and competitors. Only 2% of our schools in Ireland today have high-speed broadband. Do we know about this? Yes. These deficiencies are pointed out when, every year, in the National Competitive Council report, when, every year that I looked at, from the beginning of the noughties on, and probably further back if I took the time. On sustainability and climate change, one of the things we want to be good at, we are the highest emitters of CO2 per head in our peer group. We have the lowest share of renewable energy in our final energy consumption. We're the most dependent on energy imports, and so a strategic anxiety in terms of our overall peer group. In other words, we're the worst in class to do a peer group measurement on every one of those sustainability things. These are sobering comparisons. I don't tell them as a counsel of despair, because I'm a natural optimist, and I believe the rationalist who looks optimistically at a challenge then needs to engineer the appropriate solutions. And in this sense, I point them out to do with a correct level of ambition, to do with a quality style of analysis, but to do with a dreadful paralysis in terms of response, and this is something that this crisis must make us angry over and which we must address with some focus and determination for the future. We have to start learning to think and to act and to deliver better over a long-term horizon. I was amused by one of the panels this afternoon where the discussion of the horizon in politics was reduced not to the next election, but to the headlines the next weekend. I'm not calling long-term a horizon which extends beyond next week's headlines. I'm talking about our project for our republic, +5, +10, +15, +20 years, so that we line the things up. There's no magic wand, there's no simple solution. If Micheál Martin and the government tonight said, actually we buy all that stuff, or maybe he'll say we're already buying all that stuff and we'll do it tomorrow, it won't happen tomorrow. But I know this stuff, that we've been telling ourselves this 10 years ago, and my how come question is how come 10 years later the red lights still flash on all the measurements of the annual competitive report, because no one has addressed the red light problem in substance. And we need to get better at this. We need to match policy instruments to objectives. Having the objective is good. The engineering requires an instrument. How do you find the plug in the socket to get the energy flowing? We're stronger on definition of targets, much weaker on identity of instruments. We need to promote a new culture of accountability in respect to performance and the lack of it. This includes our ministers, of course, and they regularly give their accounts to the Dáil. But frankly, it has to reach beyond our ministers, because they may not be the problem. They may be part of the solution, they may be part of the problem, but they're not the whole problem. What we've got to do in terms of accountability before the Houses of the Oireachtas is to bring in all of those who are privileged to hold key leadership positions in the public and private sectors and in the wider society, and on key national objectives, hold them to account. And Phil Hogan was right about the Health Services Executive example. We have a space now where we have no clarity about who's accountable for what, because everybody at some level seems to be accountable for everything, and therefore, logically, for nothing. And we've got to get over this. We need our complex interface between traditional departments of state and the multiplicity of government agencies. HSE comes to mind, but it would be wrong to stay only in that groove. We need them to identify more clearly who's responsible for what. Clarity in this regard, in my opinion, has deteriorated in the past decade, not improved. We need our parliamentarians to dedicate TDs when they're debating. And this will require, of course, some Dáil reform. I don't digress. We had interesting talk on Dáil reform earlier. But my headline view, our elected representatives will have to find a way in the Dáil together of searching more often for insight than scapegoats. I think as a mature and adult audience who look at the behavioural characteristics and norms of the debate in our Parliament, we don't look there for the best debate in our society. We don't look there for intellectual profundity. We look there and see Punch and Judy, government and opposition, old-style puppet show. And we've got to find a better way, for the sake of democracy itself. We have got to find a better way in our society to spend less time scapegoating and more time discovering fruitful insights on how collectively we can move our national projects ahead. We need our senior civil servants to focus more on progress and less on process. I'm grateful to one of my conversationalists earlier today for an observation that perhaps in the last decade, public servants have learned to master procedure because of tribunalism and that class of court-based or inquiry accountability, but the procedural mastery is not a substitute for actually delivering on public policy objectives, and we need to restore the balance. We need, when they do their annual accounts and output statements and strategic management statements, to privilege sound judgment as much as those reports today seem to privilege management skills. And most of all in our republic, from what I said earlier, we need to condemn, where we see it, policy procrastination. It is, for the state we are in, an unaffordable luxury. We need to begin to find a way in our political discourse to reassert the public interest and the constitutional idea of the common good in our public sphere. Collectively, we need to rediscover the vitality of vision and values as an antidote to jaded pragmatism and to tired national political institutions. The leadership and government challenge has changed. It relates today not only to the national territory, but extends well beyond its boundaries. Externally, we share some of our sovereignty with the European Union. We're exposed more than most to the forces of globalisation. We need to take account of the needs of the territorially footloose supply chain logic of our multinational corporate stakeholders, such a vital part of the fabric of our economic performance. And internally, we've changed too. Our society has undergone radical transformation. Conformity of my youth has yielded to diversity in terms of our society. The collective has yielded much more to the individual. the balance probably has gone too far. Citizenship too often has been reduced to consumerism. We need to rediscover the meaning of citizenship in a republic. This complex matrix, in my view, the external and internal, has not been reflected to date in any significant overhaul or modernisation of our political system, whose institutional expression, and I agree here with Phil Hogan, still bears many of the hallmarks more of the 19th century than being fit to address the challenges of the 21st. Our public institutions need a spring cleaning, starting with our political institutions. I cannot overemphasise the strong belief that I have in the centrality and worth of parliamentary democracy in any state and in this republic. The Dáil in particular needs to become an effective instrument of public policy oversight and surveillance, a place, as I remarked earlier, focusing more on insight than scapegoating. If not this government, the next government should seize this moment for change. The public is prepared for transformation. The question is, are our leaders prepared to do it in their leadership and in our governance? Let me conclude. I started with my stakeholder logic. Why am I here saying these things tonight? Let me share with you a feeling. I feel a sense of shame that the legacy of my generation to my children and grandchildren has been so diminished and tainted by so much venality and corruption in the conduct of our small states' affairs. The status quo in our republic, to me, is acceptable no longer. Our rising generation is the victim of bad leadership and poor governance, public and private. They are the inheritors of high unemployment, negative equity, and mounting and costly national debt. Our policy preferences, in my view, must be from now on weighted heavily in their favour. John Kenneth Galbraith once remarked that the duty of government, and I quote, was to afflict the comfortable, to comfort the afflicted. Our rising generation is deeply afflicted by this crisis. And whether it is the property tax or other things that are hard to swallow, I expect leadership and governance in our republic which will swallow hard, which will tell it like it is, which will lay out the options, and which, if necessary, to my generation will say that we may indeed need to afflict you who are more comfortable. It's a price I would pay willingly if it would comfort the afflicted who are my children, and I hope will not be necessary to repeat the dosage for my grandchildren. Good morning.